I'm Congresswoman Katie Porter, and I am excited to be joined here today by Michael Patrick Smith. Michael is an author, a playwright, and a former oil field worker. And last month, he was my guest as a witness in the Natural Resources Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee in the hearing that we had on the oil and gas industry. Thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciated and learned from your testimony at last month's hearing about the oil and gas industry and the insights that you were able to give about what it's really like to work in an oil field, in your case in North Dakota. And there is just never enough time at hearings, not just for me to question witnesses, but really to learn from witnesses, and for witnesses to say to everything that they think Congress needs to hear. And I've testified before Congress myself, and I dread that little red light that says you have to stop talking. And so I'm really grateful here to be with you, to have the chance for me to learn more about your experiences, and for folks here joining us to be able to hear more about what it was like to work in an oil field, what those workers are going through, what we need to be thinking about as we're trying to make policy, both energy policy and also smart kind of labor and worker policy going forward. So let me just start with that by saying, open opportunity here. What would you like to say? Anything you didn't get a chance to say at the hearing? Any way that you want to kind of ground this conversation?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. I do appreciate it. And I appreciated the opportunity to testify a few weeks ago. I think, I don't know how much more I could add. I mean, I felt like for me, it was an opportunity to just to advocate for workers, really, and for the communities that extractive communities specifically. And to kind of just talk about the story of, what it is like to work in the field. I think that it's good for people, it's good for everybody to know kind of the sacrifices and the roughness and that can come from doing heavy industrial work. So I think that's my main thing. I would say I got some feedback afterwards from guys in the oil patch who felt that I'd painted maybe too bleak of a picture, or some people who had better experiences, I guess, had made money and been able to provide for their families. So, I do think it's always complicated, and there are people who are able to really make the work for them. But I do stand by, I also hear from people just about every week who tell me that I explain it exactly how they've experienced it. And I think I was in a good position to see a lot of people and how the work worked in the patch, because my job was moving oil rigs. And so an oil rig sits in one place for a couple months, it gets the oil flowing, and then I would show up and work with a group of people that basically take it all apart, load it onto trucks and move it to another location. And because of that, I had an opportunity to work with, a couple dozen drilling crews. So it felt like that gave me some good insight into what I was seeing. And, I'm just happy to be able to share those experiences and talk about some stuff that I think is important to me.
Well, I think one thing that I took from your testimony is your perspective as a worker, which was really important, but also, and I just want to flag a term that you used for our audience who's listening in, was extractive communities. And one of the things that you, I think, brought to bear was not just this is what it's like to be a worker and to be earning that income, but what happens to communities? What are the effects of sort of the boom and bust of an oil town? You were in North Dakota, and you remember one of the things you shared with us was the incredible scarcity of housing, in some cases, sex trafficking, drinking and sometimes drug abuse. These jobs are draining a lot of young people, a lot of people who are in transit, new in a community and unanchored from things like their family and churches and friends. And so those towns can, I think, there's a sort of, it's a good thing for a town when they start getting jobs and they get people moving there. And I grew up in rural Iowa, so I know that some of these rural towns need workers and they need jobs, but it can also be a kind of rough stretch for a town. Can you talk a little bit about when you first got there and kind of some of what not the oil workers, but all those, the kids in the town, the the churches in the town, the small businesses in the town, people trying to get housing. What was that part like?
Yeah, it was a wild experience. I mean, the first thing that I noticed when I drove into Williston was the collection of license plates. They were just people from every single state in the union. And you'd look into these station wagons with all their bedding piled in the back. And it was a little startling, it was kind of like, just seeing there was primarily men who had moved there to work and they were alone for the most part. A lot of guys left their families at home from where they came in order to try to make money away from their family that they could send back home. And I was really struck. I mean, it's a huge shock to a town, and there are positive things that happen. Obviously, some jobs are better than no jobs. A lot of jobs are better than no jobs. But when the jobs come super fast, they create a kind of like an earthquake in a town. And it really is a lot of the old kind of Wild West cliches. You get, when you have single men like that, you have the black market moves in. And so drugs become more readily available. Prostitution becomes pretty highly visible, which leads to sex trafficking and all kinds of those problems. Another effect is that it effectively somewhat militarizes a police force. You go from a Mayberry style police force to all of a sudden these guys have to deal with the potential of armed drunk men, driving around every night. So I know that one friend of mine, his wife was a school teacher, and they're a great couple, really good people. And she described that at the beginning of the school year, they'd have 50 students in a class. Like all of a sudden, their classes were full, and there were kids who spoke different languages. They didn't have the staff that sort of knew how to speak these different languages. And so they were doing their best. And then on any given day, she said kids would disappear, their parents would leave town. And so by the end of the school year, she was, have like 13 students or something. And so it was this incredible instability happens in the wake of something like an oil boom.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think it's just important to look at, yes, these are often decent wage jobs, good wage jobs, better than sometimes are available in other places. And that's a good thing. But I think it's important for both Democrats and Republicans to look honestly at both the good and the bad and kind of get a fuller understanding of what it's like for workers, what it's like for these communities. And, it's one thing to be in a boom town, and you mentioned kind of a Wild West. I also lived through myself in Iowa, what happened in the 1980s when the farming economy went bust. And boy, that is painful, right? A lot of things that got built, or people put up housing, or was hopeful there was going to be started a small business. And then all of a sudden when it goes bust, there are no consumers, there's nobody to buy those houses. And that can be painful too. One of the great things, and I think really interesting things about you as I've gotten to learn more, is you have done a lot of jobs. Now, I thought I'd done a lot of jobs. I've taught 8th grade. I worked at a plant nursery. And one of the little known facts about me is I was one of the costumers for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So I think I've done a few things, but you have really done a lot of jobs. How does the job that you did in North Dakota in the oil and in the oil fields compare to some of the other jobs you've done that are sort of blue collar or manual labor kinds of jobs? The working conditions, the wages, the quality of life, the health risks. Can you paint that picture for us?
Yeah, I have worked a lot of jobs, and I think when I was younger, I fell in love with the arts, and that kind of led me on that path. I'm the 6th of 7 kids, and the first boy in my family to graduate high school. It's the first in my family to attend college. And I did that because of an acting scholarship, a theater scholarship, and sort of just to support partly my desire to live an artistic life. I've ended up doing all kinds of things, but and most of them have been blue collar jobs, just because I prefer that work. I find that it's just more fulfilling for me to work with my hands. The main difference between anything I've done in the oil patch is sort of the level of the danger that comes with the work. It's just, and it's not a complaint. It's in some ways, it's kind of what drew me to the work was a sense that there was danger. You really had to be on your toes. And you really needed to trust the guy next to you because you've got big pieces of metal flying around. You've just got industrial equipment moving around, things snap, things break, and there's the potential of really getting hurt. On top of that, the wages were okay. I mean, with the job that I had, the wages were far from fantastic, and the benefits were far from fantastic. I didn't feel I liked a lot of the guys in my company and a lot of the guys who ran the crews and the dispatchers, but the safety man at the company I worked was basically absent. And so getting things like cold weather gear would sort of be met with shrugs, or it was like a drag for him to like have to talk to you about it when you're working in, -20, -30 and colder temperatures. That was so those things were probably the biggest factors and the biggest. I would also just say it's the hardest work I've ever done. I mean, I've worked as a furniture mover, and that's a little bit close, but the hours doing that weren't the same. So in the oil patch, you're working 12 to 14-hour days is a pretty standard thing, doing the kind of job that I was doing. I was on call every day, which is almost like a psychological torture. I don't think it's just not a good way to live, because you just never know when you're going to get that call. A lot of oil field jobs are 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. And I think that can be better for people, but that's also something that's real hard on families. If you're away from your wife and kids for 2 weeks and then back for 2 weeks, not working, I saw a lot of guys struggle with kind of trying to manage that lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. No, and I just want to read a little bit, if it's okay, from your testimony, following up on what you said about the average sort of 12 to 14-hour day. You said the longest day I worked was 17 and a half hours. The longest week I recorded working was 95 and a half hours. I once worked 172 hours over the course of 14 days. I feel all busted up, I told the truck driver I was working with. Get used to it, he said. I think those stories and those voices that you share are really, really an important part of it here. And I think, there should be a way to recognize that we need to do tough jobs, tough, dirty, and dangerous jobs. They're going to be part of our economy. They're a part of every or most countries' economies. But how can we do it in a way that we're making sure that we're not damaging workers' potential to earn? And we talked about this in the hearing, but you saw men lose their lives in the oil fields.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I never witnessed anybody who lost their life, but I worked with guys who had been seriously injured and who had witnessed people dying. And one of my closest friends passed away from an opioid overdose kind of as soon as he left the field. But you really see that it does, the work can shorten people's lives. And I just feel that it needs to be taken into consideration. The thing that pisses me off is when you hear that, well, people are grateful to have these jobs and they're happy and they feel grateful. And the answer is, of course, people are happy and feel grateful to have work. But gratitude is a spiritual process, as a spiritual practice. It is not a paycheck. And I think that that working people in this country show their gratitude to the bosses with their bodies. They show it with their busted knees and their bad backs and their worn out shoulders and their calloused hands. And it's a way of life. And so the question for me is always, well, how do the CEOs, how do these investors and CEOs and shareholders, how do you want to show your gratitude toward working people who do the stuff? And that to me is sort of an important thing. Like, it needs to be a bit more of a two-way street there.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. And I think one of the things, in Congress, people have a lot of opinions, and you heard a lot of them when you came to testify about, oil and gas industries and extractive industries and what our transition to clean energy is going to look like. But I think one of the things I really appreciated about your perspective was, there's a need to do right by workers, period, full stop, across industries. And the more dangerous and the more difficult the work, the higher that burden is to put in place those safety precautions. I mean, I'm a mom. I don't want to look for mittens for my kids. I'm sure your safety officer didn't want to find you the kind of cold weather equipment you needed, but I'm responsible for those people. And, I think it's important for everyone to remember that, yes, capital and these New York bankers and the risk takers and entrepreneurs and investors and shareholders and all these groups that we hear about, yes, they are part of our economy, but so are the people who do the labor. And a strong economy, a really healthy economy, will treat all those people right? And I think that includes the workers who are the entry-level workers and the temporary jobs who are driving across country to find any way they can to get food for themselves and for their family. I just wanted to turn quickly, we have about 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to turn quickly to talking about your current work as a writer, because you've just published a memoir called Good Hand, and it talks about what it was like for you in the oil field. You mentioned being an actor. What inspires you to kind of make that jump from acting and that kind of performance to telling your own story very personally in your book, The Good Hand?
Yeah, so I had, I'd been living in, it's kind of a funny thing, a lot's been made of me kind of moving from New York. I've been living in New York and moved to the oil field. And so there's been a lot of like Brooklyn hipster becomes oil field hand, which I don't think really accurately describes my situation. But, I went out to I was sort of just dissatisfied in the way that my life was going for a lot of different reasons. And some of them were financial, some of them were more spiritual or, just personally kind of working through some things in my life. And I wanted a big change. And so I went out to North Dakota to work. I'd always been writing, I've written since I was a little kid. And I knew I was going to a place where there'd be great stories. I also played music and so I'm always attracted to where the stories are. And when I got to North Dakota and began in the oil patch, I was sending emails to some friends of mine just to kind of keep them abreast of my situation. And some of them, it seemed like I was like on a different planet, but I was getting all this great feedback from my friends. My emails to them were getting longer and longer and longer. And I began to see it as, the potential of writing something that would be a tribute to these guys that I work with. Because it really does, you really do feel, there is a feeling of feeling marginalized when you're in these communities and a feeling that your story isn't being told. And I fell in love with some of these dudes, they're great friends of mine to this day. And so I wanted to do something that would honor them. As I got further and further into it, it became kind of clear to me that I was also talking about personal aspects of people's lives and talking about people on days that were not their best days. And it became clear to me that the only way for me to be able to kind of look at them in the eye and the way for me to justify what I was doing was to kind of put myself under the microscope as much as I put them under the microscope. And through that, the book became very much about the oil field and also kind of an examination of my family and the dynamics that I grew up in. As much. So it's ended up being, it's funny because it's a book about the oil patch, but it's like a very healing book in a lot of ways. I feel like that's kind of what it's about, maybe more than anything.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading The Good Hand. I have a lot of long plane rides back and forth between Washington, D.C. and California. And so a lot of time to read, but I think it's, like I said, your experience as a worker. And I think one of the things that I hear from a lot of Americans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, whether they are interested in politics or don't really believe in the political system, they're disappointed in it, is just a sense that everyday Americans' experiences and stories are not really being heard and understood by members of Congress. And so I'll just close by sharing with kind of something that happened to me. As I went to run for Congress, and they said, well, we'll talk about your minivan. And they're like, do you really own a minivan? And I was like, yes, like I got 3 kids. Like, how else would I get them from place to place? Like, of course I have a minivan. Like, it's some kind of fictional thing, right? Like, I'm not making this up. Like, I am a minivan driving mom. Like, that is the reality. And so I do think, as we talk about, whose voices get heard, we hear the voices of the oil and gas industry. And like I said, whether we agree with them or we don't agree with them, whether we have concerns about what they're saying, which I often do, or whether we represent, as some of my colleagues do, communities that, really benefit from that extractive economy, that doesn't mean we hear from the workers doing those jobs. And from people living in these communities that are often dealing with pollution, often dealing with, as you said, some of that boom and bust economy. So thank you so much, Michael Patrick Smith, for sharing your story with us and for joining with me today. And I look forward to reading Good Hand on my next flight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and I appreciate the chance to talk about this stuff with you.
Thank you.